Yeah, I would add too. These fires, of course, burned for roughly an hour in the Twin Trade Towers. And during that period of time, something like 380 firefighters were working in the buildings. That is to say, New York City Fire Department assumed that these buildings, even though there'd been fires, would be stable, were reachable. The fires could be controlled. In fact, the voice communication from the firefighters inside the building said, "We need more hoses, we need more water, but we're working our way up the from floor to floor." And so the assumption was that the integrity of these buildings was never in question. And of course, that's why something like 380 firefighters lost their lives, because they didn't expect these buildings to collapse. And when they did collapse, they were on the scene, unfortunately. And so this is something that, an analysis from their own way of proceeding, which is, of course, to understand the structural integrity of these buildings from the buildings department. They assumed that there was no possibility that these buildings would collapse. So they're the experts, and events proved them wrong, but not necessarily because of the fires, but because of this additional element that we've just been discussing, this new variable.
So many people in New York lost their lives. There was a video put out by the widows of some of the firefighters who lived in New Jersey. I think they were the instigators for the first investigation. In fact, George Bush would have had no investigation at all if it hadn't been for them. And there were so many, as you mentioned, 300 firefighters or more. In New York, there's a ballot item now. New York or many New Yorkers are asking for an independent investigation, and that, of course, you can understand why with so many people. But in Burlington, we had a ballot item for the city of Burlington to advise Vermont's congressional delegation to demand a new, thorough, and truly independent forensic investigation that fully addresses the many questions surrounding the tragic events of September 11. 37% of those who voted supported the measure, including majorities in the 2 downtown wards. Now, there aren't that many people campaigning, so we weren't able to distribute literature and make people aware in the other 5 wards. But the majority in the wards where we were able to contact people voted in favor of a new investigation. And it's the least we can do for these people who died and their relatives to determine what really happened, don't you think?
Well, the other big thing, the big picture here, is this really was the whole catalyst for the war on terror, which has changed everyone's lives. Certainly September 11th did, but it was what happened after that really that changed everyone's lives. In the U.S. and around the world, it was the invasion of Iraq, the invasion of Afghanistan, and the whole war on terror, which is all pretty much based on this story. And if it turns out that this story, which it does, has all these problems, then where are we? Why are we involved in the war on terror? Why did we do all these things? And I think that's one of the biggest problems with people have a hard time grasping this, because it really causes a big problem if you realize, which we have, that there's a serious problem with the war on terror here. We have no proof, and a lot of us would still love to see this. I'd love for somebody to come up to me someday and say, hey, I can show you that this happened the way they said it did. I'd love to learn that. That would make my day. It would make my year. But nobody's done that. And nobody's proven to anybody, really, that it happened the way it did. Quite on the contrary. And now we have this billion-dollar war on terror. People are dying, every day because of this, which was all set off by 9/11. So that's really, I think, to me, the big picture is we want, hopefully, these questions answered, so maybe we can stop all this stuff that's going on.
Well, it's not $1 billion war on terror. It's a $3 trillion war. That's 1 billion times with 3 zeros added on the end, multiplied by 3.
Once again, those numbers are all too big for me.
And you know, I think we all agree with Pete that we would be extremely happy if it could be proved that, in fact, the official story was essentially right. But I think that's impossible.
Right.
You know, but as bad as Pete says that this is, and as important as Pete points out it is, because this story is the basis of the war on terror, it's even more important than that, I would submit, because if we are living in an environment, in a civilization, under a structure in which a crime of this nature and magnitude can be pulled off and not investigated and not discovered, and those of us who have looked at the facts basically branded conspiracy theorists, that system is going to create equally bad and potentially worse problems for all of us going down the road. Because if they can get away with that, a crime so horrific, and yet the media won't touch it for the most part, our politicians for the most part won't touch it, you know, where are the limits? And what if we get a president who's not a saint like our current president? And of course I don't mean that, but you can have your own opinion. But you know, what if we do get anyone in our government or connected to our government who has an agenda like the instigators of 9/11, perhaps even worse? It can happen again if we live in a system where something like this goes undetected, undiscovered. Well, we've discovered it, but where there's no dialogue about it. And that's the scariest thing for me, is that there's not even a dialogue. You know, and I tell people, when they ask, you know, my experiences after learning what I've learned about 9/11, you know, what it's been like for me. And what I say to people is, you know, as bad as it was to discover that the official story about 9/11 couldn't be true, that's not nearly as bad, in my view, as discovering that that we don't have, at least we haven't had, the means to even create a dialogue about it, that people are unwilling to talk about it in large measure. You know, that's to me even more disturbing. And I think we all know, those of us who've looked at this, we all know many, many people who agree with us, and yet they won't admit it publicly because of their reputations. They don't want to be considered, you know, on the fringe. They don't want to risk their professional reputations, whatever it may be. I mean, someone like Charles, who's a university professor, I have great respect for, because, you know, he's going out on a limb here, and people, actually, professors have lost their jobs over this. So in addition to being the catalyst for the war on terror, I think the bigger problem is that we have a system that enabled this to happen.
It seems to me that this is American politics as usual. If we look back over the history of America, I would recommend Howard Zinn's book, People's History of the United States. Look back at the other wars, for instance, World War II or World War I, the sinking of the Lusitania. How did that happen, and why did that happen? You know, the people recognize that, but still you say, well, nobody, some people always recognize what is happening, but it's not accepted by the majority because of the control that the oligarchy exerts through the media. World War II, there was evidence that the administration knew that the Japanese attack was coming. That's where the idea that they knew about 9/11, because there's so much evidence that the attack on Pearl Harbor was well known and that it was needed because Roosevelt wanted to enter the Second World War. And now with 9/11, we have the Project for the New American Century, where there was a paper sometime before the attack, I think 6 months before, and it said that something like Pearl Harbor, New Pearl Harbor was needed in order to justify ramping up the expenditure for military and American control. Now that we're a superpower, the only superpower, how can we control the world? And you go back to the Spanish-American War. Well, what happened to that American ship in the Cuban harbor? Who blew that up? Well, many people have claimed, and the evidence seems to show historically, that that was blown up by American operatives in order to create an excuse for war against Spain. It's just history as usual, I think.